The clock on the control panel read 3:17 in the morning, then flickered, buzzed, and rolled backward to 2:51 like a throat swallowing a word it wasn't supposed to say. I felt the change before I trusted my eyes. The concrete under my boots had a low tremor in it, steady all night, but suddenly it knocked out of rhythm like a second heartbeat trying to cut in front of the first. The air in the control room tasted stale and metallic, dry enough to chap the back of my throat with that faint electrical burn you get standing too close to old transformer boxes. Then I heard footsteps above me. Not outside, not wind, not gravel shifting on the hatch cover. Footsteps, slow, measured, carrying through layers of steel and concrete from the sealed surface access like someone was pacing directly over my head, and the upper hatch had been locked for hours. I looked at the monitor wall because that was what the manual said to do. Trust the system, keep eyes on the feeds. Log anomalies and continue normal operations. One of the camera windows crackled with static, then cleared. It showed the control room from the corner angle behind the storage cabinet. In that feed, I was standing at the main console. I wasn't moving. I wasn't checking the screens or writing in the logbook or turning toward the sound above. I was just standing there with both hands flat on the console, staring directly into the camera like I knew it was watching me. When I turned to look behind me, the footsteps stopped in the middle of a step. The whole station went so quiet I could hear the clicking in the walls spell out a pattern I still hadn't learned how to read. Which was I supposed to trust, the equipment in front of me or the warning that said if it matched too perfectly, I was already too late? That was 6 nights into the job. I got to Divide County just before sunset, driving north out past Crosby with the heater on low and the windows cracked because the truck I'd been issued smelled like vinyl, old coffee, and somebody else's cigarettes ground into the seat foam. The road emptied out by degrees. Houses got farther apart. Fences got longer. The sky flattened into that North Dakota winter color that wasn't really gray and wasn't really blue, just a cold sheet stretched tight over fields hard as iron. The site itself didn't look like much when I first saw it. A chain-link perimeter fence, a squat concrete access structure, a few utility sheds sunk low against the wind, no missile. In no personnel. No sign the place had ever mattered enough to keep staffed except for the fact that somebody was still paying me to sit inside it all night and watch numbers. I was good at jobs like that. Or I thought I was. I had a background in remote systems monitoring, mostly grain storage automation and water control networks. The kind of work where nothing dramatic happened if everybody upstream had done their jobs right. You learned to trust routine. You learned that most failures announce themselves small at first, in the tone of a pump, in the spacing of error codes and a temperature drift half a degree off. Competence in that line of work meant noticing things before they became somebody else's emergency. Lyle Brackett met me at the site with his collar up against the wind and a ring of keys that looked older than I was, and he didn't shake hands. His skin was red from the cold and his breath carried coffee that had been sitting too long on a burner. "You Colby Rennick." It wasn't really a question, but I answered it anyway. He gave a short nod toward the access structure. "Night monitoring, system integrity, log anomalies, call if something stops responding." That was the whole pitch. No sales job, no effort to make the place sound important. Just a task spoken in the flat tone of a man who wanted to get back into his truck before the heat leaked out of it. Inside, the station smelled like sealed concrete, dust baked into electrical housings and recycled air that had been passing through metal lungs too long. A ladder dropped from the entry chamber into the control room below. When my boots hit the bottom, you and I felt that low vibration through the soles at once. Not enough to shake anything loose, just enough that my ankles kept expecting it to settle and it never did. The sensation reminded me of standing beside heavy industrial compressors, except it wasn't regular. It pulsed just off the beat my body wanted to give it. The control room had one long bank of monitors, two instrument panels, a desk bolted to the wall, a narrow bunk behind a partition, and a sealed corridor leading deeper into the structure. No windows, no natural sound, only fans, cable hum, and that faint clicking from inside the walls. I looked for the source automatically, tracking it panel to panel, but it never stayed in one place. It moved through the concrete like rain traveling under a roof. Lyle Brackett handed me a thin binder with the station seal on the front and said, "Official manual. Read it before midnight. Most of it's common sense." He said official like there were unofficial versions, but at the time I only noticed it because the word landed a little too hard. I opened the binder while he stood there, rubbing his hands for warmth. The pages were clean, machine-typed, recent enough that the toner still had that warm plastic smell. The rules were simple. Trust all readings from the primary monitoring system unless directly instructed otherwise. Do not leave the control room between 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning under any circumstances. If you observe inconsistencies in time display, log them and continue normal operations. The upper hatch remains sealed during night operations. Any sounds from above are environmental. I remember glancing up after that last one. Environmental, I said. Lyle Brackett didn't smile. Metal settles. Wind gets under the outer structure. You'll hear things. Don't build stories out of it. Then he showed me how to cycle the feeds, where to record anomalies, which relay panel not to touch, and which number to call if the system lost synchronization. He used the word synchronization once and moved past it before I could ask what it synchronized with. At the time, I assumed it was just network language. Every place like that had its own jargon. I didn't understand yet that he was answering a different question from the one I would have asked. Before he left, he paused by the ladder and looked back down at me through the steel rungs. His voice had a strange carefulness to it then, like he was selecting each word under supervision. "You replace Everett Halverson, you don't imitate him." I asked what had happened to Everett Halverson. Lyle Brackett took a second too long to answer. In that pause, I heard the clicking in the wall line up into 3 quick taps, then 2, then 3 again. He stopped reporting. That was all he gave me. No resignation paperwork, no accident, no family emergency, just a vacancy shaped like a man who had once sat at the desk I was now standing beside. After he climbed out, I heard the upper hatch shut with a deep iron thud, then the wheel mechanism lock. The sound carried down the shaft and into my ribs. A little while later, his truck started outside and rolled away, tires crunching over frost-hardened gravel until the noise thinned out into the empty land. Then it was just me, and the stale metal taste in the air and the station settling around my breathing like it had been waiting for a replacement to arrive. Looking back, that was the last moment the job still felt like a job. I unpacked in under 20 minutes. Thermal bag in the desk, spare flashlight in the drawer, notebook beside the official logbook, gloves on the shelf by the ladder. When I started organizing the desk itself, I found out how little the station had actually been turned over between operators. The top drawer held fresh pens and forms. The second had sealed manuals, extra batteries, and a yellow legal pad still in its plastic wrap. The bottom drawer stuck halfway open until I jerked it hard enough to shake dust loose from the runners. Something in the metal frame had warped, probably from age or temperature, and that was when I noticed the screws. One panel beneath the desk sat a fraction wider than the rest. Same paint, same shape. But the right side had been removed before. The screw heads were worn bright. I could smell warm dust when I leaned down, and under it something older. Paper that had sat sealed in dry air for years. I used the little flathead from my keyring and worked the panel loose. Behind it was a cavity barely big enough for wiring and a folded stack of pages wrapped in an oilcloth rag. The cloth smelled faintly like machine grease and the copper stink of old pennies. The pages inside were filled edge to edge in cramped handwriting, dark pencil pressed hard enough to dent the paper. The first line read, "If you're reading this, Lyle Brackett gave you the clean rules." I actually laughed once under my breath, yet not because it was funny, because it felt so ordinary. Every isolated job develops folklore. Some burned-out operator gets cabin fever, starts seeing meaning in maintenance codes, leaves behind a little conspiracy for the next poor bastard. I had walked into places where men swore the boilers knew their names. I had heard stories about water treatment sensors predicting deaths in town. Long shifts and repetitive environments did things to people. You couldn't work remote systems without becoming a student of the kinds of stories loneliness liked to invent. Still, I kept reading. The handwriting belonged to Everett Halverson. He'd signed one page halfway through like he expected doubt. His notes weren't organized, they were layered, arrows between margins, sentences crossed out, and then rewritten lower down as if he'd changed his mind after seeing the same event twice. He'd copied 4 rules in larger letters than the rest. If the system readings match perfectly, do not trust them. I remember sitting back in Everett Halverson's chair with the note in my hands and glancing up at the monitors. Every readout lined up beautifully. Voltage steady, timing stable, environmental controls within tolerance. It looked like the healthiest system I'd ever inherited. Then the next one. If you hear movement above you, it means the hatch is open. Do not check it. I read that 3 times. The recycled air hissed through ceiling vents. The clicking inside the wall paused, then resumed from farther off like something had shifted position to listen. The third line was worse. Between 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning is when it runs corrections. Stay somewhere it cannot see you directly. The official manual said not to leave the control room during those hours. Everett Halverson's note said the control room was exactly where I shouldn't be if I wanted to remain unseen. That wasn't normal worker paranoia. That was a contradiction precise enough to bother me. To write a thing like that, Everett Halverson had either been deeply unstable or deeply observant. Then the last rule. If you see yourself on the monitors, leave immediately. That version is not delayed, it is ahead. I felt a dry taste bloom at the back of my tongue, sharper than the metallic air. It was the taste of old fear waking up, not full panic. Just the body's tiny admission that something in the room had stopped fitting the frame you'd assigned it. I told myself Everett Halverson had cracked from isolation. I told myself the contradictions were what made the note convincing. Anybody can invent a ghost story. It takes a certain broken logic to invent instructions that can't both be followed at once. That kind of thing sticks in your head. So I folded the pages back up, but I didn't put them away. I slid them into the top drawer instead, under the official manual, close enough to reach without standing. That decision mattered more than I knew. If I'd hidden them again, maybe I'd have followed the clean version of events longer. Maybe I'd have lasted less time. I still can't decide which possibility is worse. My first few hours passed quietly. I learned the panel layout. I ran routine checks. I verified signal continuity across archive channels and watched the outside camera feeds darken as the last light bled out of the sky. There wasn't much to see above ground. The access structure, fenced gravel. A windswept apron of empty land silvered with frost. Beyond that, distance. North Dakota has a way of making distance feel physical. Even underground you can sense it, the open ground pressing down with nothing to interrupt it. Just before midnight, I started hearing the clicking more clearly. Not louder, more distinct, irregular but not random. Bursts of taps separated by long silences, then the same spacing again from somewhere else in the wall. I got up with a flashlight and checked the conduit runs, the relay boxes, the vent panels. Nothing loose, no rodent noise, no thermal expansion crackle. And it reminded me of an old telegraph relay trying to speak through concrete. At the time, I assumed it was one of those tiny station details your brain latches onto because the rest of the environment is too controlled. I know now that the clicking was the first honest thing in that room. A little after 1 in the morning, I went back over Everett Halverson's notes more carefully and realized something I should have noticed right away. He wasn't writing like a man trying to convince somebody. He was writing like a man trying to remember the right sequence before it changed again. Whole lines had been rewritten to clarify order. One margin note just said, "If this is still here, then hiding it worked in at least one pass." In at least one pass, that phrase stayed with me. Up to then, and I thought the real question was whether Everett Halverson had become unreliable. By the end of that first night, I had started asking a different one. Not whether he was wrong, whether he'd had access to information I didn't. The first discrepancy came at 3 minutes past 1 in the morning. I remember the exact time because I was logging a minor fluctuation in one of the secondary channels. Nothing serious, just a small drift in phase alignment that corrected itself while I was still watching it. I marked the event, checked the master clock mounted above the center monitor bank and saw 1:13. Then every display in the room flickered. Not black, not off, just a brief dimming, as if all the light had passed through dirty glass for half a second. The vibration in the floor thickened under my boots. I heard that low, out-of-sync pulse skip ahead, and the clicking in the wall snapped into a tight machine-fast chatter. When the displays stabilized, the master clock read 12:47. 26 minutes earlier. I stared at it long enough for my eyes to ache from the screen glow. Then I checked the console timer. Same result. The backup clock in the logging software. Same. The little digital readout on the environmental controls. Same again. No disagreement anywhere. Perfect synchronization. That was the first time Everett Halverson's note came back to me with real weight behind it. If the system readings match perfectly, do not trust them. I didn't panic, that's important. People think the dividing line in stories like this is fear, but it isn't. It's procedure. Fear doesn't kill competence unless you let it. So I treated it as an instrumentation anomaly, exactly the way I'd been trained to handle a discrepancy. I cross-checked what I could against what I knew. I looked for signs of a reset, a power fluctuation, a cached display issue. I checked file timestamps in the last several logs. I looked for interruptions in the archived sensor stream. Everything indicated that, as far as the station was concerned, it really was 12:47. There were no gaps, no breaks, no sign 26 minutes had gone anywhere. So I did what the official manual told me to do. I logged it. I wrote, "Master clock and all link displays reversed by 26 minutes at approximately 1:13 in the morning by personal reference. System otherwise stable. No concurrent loss of signal detected." The pen scratched loudly in the quiet room, and I can still hear it. Dry ballpoint over government stock paper. Even the sound seemed too sharp, like the station wanted a record made. I finished the sentence, capped the pen, and looked down at the page. My entry was already there, 2 lines higher than where I had written it. Same wording. Same crooked tail on the Y in approximately, same pressure marks in the paper, same little blot where my pen had hesitated before the word stable. Only the timestamp beside it read 12:49 in the morning. For a few seconds, I honestly thought I was looking at duplicate pages. I flipped back, checked the sheet number, touched the fresh ink. It smeared onto my fingertip, tacky and recent. Below it, on the line where I'd just written, there was nothing. Blank paper, no new indentation except the marks from my hand bracing the page. And I had watched myself write the entry. I had felt the pen move. but the record of that action existed earlier on the page than the moment I had performed it. That detail seemed minor at the time. I have thought about it every day since. I took out my own notebook and copied the same sentence into that, slowly, changing a single word so I could distinguish one entry from the other. This time I wrote, "System otherwise nominal." When I finished, I checked the page twice, then closed the notebook and set it under my palm for a full minute. When I opened it again, the line was still where I'd put it. My notebook hadn't changed. Only the station log had. That told me something useful. Not enough, but something. The effect wasn't centered on me, it was selective. Context mattered. System records mattered. And maybe official records mattered more than private ones. That was the kind of distinction a professional notices because it implies design. Malfunctions spread. They don't curate. I pulled the official manual back out and reread the time discrepancy rule. If you observe inconsistencies in time display, log them and continue normal operations. That instruction assumed the discrepancy would remain an observation. It had already crossed the line into interaction. By logging it, I hadn't documented the anomaly. I had participated in it. I called Lyle Brackett's number. The line picked up after one ring, but nobody spoke. I heard only a thin bed of static and something beneath it that sounded almost like breath passing over a microphone from very far away. "Lyle Brackett," I said. "It's Colby Rennick at Divide County. I've got a clock reversal and a log issue. I need clarification on the time display protocol." The static thickened. Then, in a voice so distorted it took me a second to realize it was mine, I heard, "Continue normal operations." The line went dead. I didn't call back. Maybe I should have. Maybe by then it wouldn't have mattered. I sat very still for a while after that, breathing the dry metallic air and listening to the wall clicks settle into a slower pattern. I remember rubbing the fresh smear of logbook ink between my fingers until it dried into a dark powder. The question I had started with was simple. Was the equipment malfunctioning? By the end of that hour, I was already pursuing a different one. Why did the official procedure tell me to feed the anomaly into the one system that seemed capable of moving the record of my actions backward in time? At 2:13 in the morning, I heard someone walking above the hatch. The sound came down the ladder shaft so clearly I knew at once it wasn't wind. It had weight to it, a human gait, heel, toe, slow enough to sound deliberate, not rushed. I could hear grit shift under each step and a hollow transfer through the steel cover at the top. The taste of the air changed when it started, sharper, more metallic, like the vents had pulled a charge in from outside. I froze with one hand on the logbook. The official rule came back first. The upper hatch remains sealed during night operations. Any sounds from above are environmental. And then Everett Halverson's note laid itself over it like a second transparency. If you hear movement above you, it means the hatch is open. Do not check it. Those two instructions couldn't both come from people who understood the station in the same way. One was dismissive. The other was precise. Not, "You might think the hatch is open." Not, "It could mean something is wrong." It means the hatch is open. Do not check it. The footsteps crossed once from left to right, paused, then crossed back. The vibration in the floor stayed steady, but the clicking in the walls stopped completely. That silence was worse than the footsteps. After hours of irregular tapping, the sudden absence felt intentional, like an audience holding breath. I stood up slowly. My chair made a soft fabric scrape on the concrete, and the steps above halted for one beat, and then resumed. I wish I could tell you I made the right choice because I was brave or intuitive. The truth is uglier and smaller than that. I chose not to climb the ladder because I couldn't decide which version of me I'd be by the time I reached the top. The station had already taken one written action and moved its record earlier. I had already heard my own voice on a deadline telling me to continue. Everett Halverson's notes sounded insane right up until they didn't. By 2:13 in the morning, I no longer trusted the space between an action and its consequence. So I did nothing. I stayed below and listened. The footsteps continued for maybe a minute. Maybe less. That's another thing the station took from me early. Confidence in duration. Time in that room began to feel less like a line and more like a pressure field. And moments stretched when I watched them and collapsed when I tried to measure them. I moved toward the ladder anyway, only a few steps, close enough that I could smell the colder air descending the shaft. Not outside air exactly, not fresh. Just less filtered, carrying a trace of frost, old rust, and something mineral underneath like wet stone where there shouldn't have been any wetness at all. The footsteps stopped instantly, not faded, not moved away. Stopped in the middle of a step. I know that sounds like a dramatic way to put it, but it's the only accurate one. There was the rhythm of motion, then no motion with no completion to the sound. No settling shift in weight, no scrape, no final contact. Just absence, clean as a switch thrown. I looked up the shaft. All I could see was the circle of the hatch far above, its underside black against the dim emergency light. Nothing moved. I stayed there longer than I should have, listening hard enough that my ears began to ring. The low-frequency throb under the floor rose into my calves. The air smelled dry enough to crackle. Somewhere in the wall to my right, the clicking resumed with a new cadence, slower, almost patient. I backed away from the ladder. Then I did something I haven't told many people because it sounds trivial next to everything else. I checked the floor dust below the shaft. No fresh grit, no flakes of rust, no dirt. If somebody had opened the hatch in winter and walked above it, some sign should have shaken loose. Instead, the concrete beneath the ladder was undisturbed except for my own boot prints and a thin trail where I'd dragged a chair earlier. I wrote none of that in the official log. Instead, I took out Everett Halverson's notes and read the second rule again, tracing the grooves his pencil had left in the page. His handwriting had dug so deep into the paper that the line could be felt from the back like a scar. If you hear movement above you, it means the hatch is open. Do not check it. I still didn't know how he knew that, but the footsteps stopping the instant I approached the ladder told me something new. Whatever was happening above the hatch was responsive, not random settling, not environmental. It recognized proximity, or the station did on its behalf. That tightened another question into place. Not just how long this system had been running. How many operators before me had heard someone walking overhead, obeyed the official instruction to ignore it, and never understood they had just been given proof the station knew when they were coming closer. A little before 3 in the morning on the fourth night, the second feed came alive. By then I had spent enough time underground to stop wasting effort on the wrong explanations. I no longer told myself the clicking was harmless. I no longer treated the vibration as background. I had started tracking patterns in a private notebook and comparing them to the official logs, looking for mismatches between what the station recorded and what I remembered living through. The pattern was already there if you knew where to look. Tiny revisions, timestamps shaving past each other. Sensor alignments going unnaturally perfect right after minor disturbances. The system didn't like rough edges, it smoothed them. And that night the control room was colder than usual. Not by much, a degree, maybe 2. But the difference showed up first in my fingertips and teeth. The air tasted like a battery terminal, that dry sourness of old charge. I was midway through reviewing archived channel integrity when one of the unused monitor windows flashed white and opened on its own. No input from me, no command tone. It simply activated. The feed showed the control room from an angle I didn't recognize. Higher than the mounted cameras, slightly farther back. as if the room had grown a corner behind the corner it actually had. The perspective was wrong in small ways that my eye kept trying to correct. Lines looked true until you followed them. Then they'd bend a fraction too late. And there I was, at the main console, standing still, both hands flat on the surface, and head tilted down just enough that I couldn't see my own expression clearly. Until the figure lifted its face and looked directly into the lens. Into me, maybe. Into the version of me watching. I wasn't at the console. I was sitting at the desk with Everett Halverson's notes in front of me and a cooling cup of coffee at my elbow. I knew where my body was. I could feel the edge of the desk pressing into my forearms. I could smell stale coffee and dust. But the feed was clear. Not static distorted, not lagged. Clearer than the live camera views I used all night. I stood up too fast, chair legs scraping, and looked at the actual console. Empty. I looked back at the screen. The other me was still there. He didn't move when I moved. That was the first detail that broke my mind's attempt to file it under delay or reflection, even if it had been latency, even severe latency. I should have seen a trailing version of my own panic. Instead, the figure remained calm and fixed, watching from a slightly ahead position I hadn't occupied. I took one step toward the console in the real room. The figure on the monitor lifted one hand and touched the display glass from the inside. My skin went cold in a way I still haven't felt anywhere else. Not fear exactly. Recognition without context. The terrible professional moment when you realize a system is responding intelligently, but to a variable you didn't know it could perceive. Everett Halverson's fourth rule came back to me with absolute clarity. If you see yourself on the monitors, leave immediately. That version is not delayed, it is ahead. Ahead of what? Ahead by how much? Ahead in time or ahead in selection? And those were the questions that mattered, and I still asked them in the wrong order. I didn't leave immediately. That's the part that damns me more than anything. I investigated. I switched inputs. The feed persisted. I checked camera assignments. The channel identifier didn't correspond to any installed unit. I cut power to the monitor bank for 3 seconds and brought it back up. The normal feeds rebooted in sequence. The duplicate feed returned first, already populated as if it hadn't ever been interrupted at all. Then the figure on the screen did something I still dream about. He turned his head a few degrees toward the ladder shaft at the exact moment I heard the first footstep above. Not a second before the sound. At it. Perfectly coincident, as though the image and the event were generated from the same command. At the step above carried down through steel. The figure's eyes shifted toward it. Then he looked back at the camera and very slowly shook his head once. No. It wasn't my imagination. I know how memory inflates under stress. This wasn't that. The gesture was deliberate and restrained, exactly the way I'd signal somebody not to speak in a control room if I thought a microphone was hot. I didn't move. The footsteps above crossed once and stopped. The duplicate me remained at the console for another 5 seconds. Then the feed collapsed into static and disappeared, leaving the normal camera layout behind as if nothing unusual had happened. The room felt emptier after it was gone, not safer. Just less explained, and the clicking in the walls came back in rapid little clusters that put me in mind of relay logic processing millions of tiny decisions at once. That was the moment my investigation changed shape. Up to then, I'd been trying to determine whether the station's monitoring system was inaccurate. After that, I had to consider the opposite. The feed wasn't wrong. It was impossible in a very specific direction. It wasn't showing where I had been. It was showing where some version of me either would be or should be. I wrote none of that in the official log. Instead, I wrote unauthorized feed activation, cause unknown. No immediate impact on primary system. A lie, technically. but also a test. I wanted to see whether the station would revise falsehood as readily as truth. It didn't. The entry stayed where I wrote it, and that told me something I wish I hadn't learned. The system didn't merely alter records, it discriminated between useful information and noise. If you mislabeled an event, the record remained stable. If you described the anomaly accurately, it got folded backward into the official timeline. At the time, I thought that meant I could outmaneuver it by speaking around the truth. I know now I was only learning the shape of the cage. The next shift was when the repetition started, not loops. That word's wrong. Loops imply a circle, something returning unchanged to its origin. What happened in the control room was closer to revision. A moment would occur, then occur again with one tiny adjustment, as if some hidden hand had rejected the first draft and tried a second. The first example was so small I almost missed it. I dropped my pen, and it hit the edge of the desk, bounced once, and rolled left toward the logbook. I bent to catch it, but before my fingers closed, the room gave one of those brief pressure changes I'd come to recognize. The floor tremor thickened. The taste of the air sharpened. The clicking in the wall went silent. My hand was back on the desk. The pen slipped from my fingers again. This time it hit the edge, bounced once, and rolled right, away from the logbook, coming to rest against the leg of the chair. I stood there with my hand half open, staring at it. The change wasn't dramatic. Same pen, same motion, different result. The kind of tiny correction nobody would build a theory from if it happened only once. But it didn't happen only once. Over the next hour, I watched a coffee ring appear on the desk, vanish, then appear smaller. I heard a relay chirp twice with a different pause after it each time. I reread a line in Everett Halverson's notes and realized a word I thought was crossed out had never been written that way at all. Every time the shift came, the same sensory sequence preceded it. The vibration misaligned. The stale air took on that electrical sting. The clicking paused. Then the world resumed with one detail placed differently. I started running tests because that was still the only way I knew to stay sane. I positioned objects, timed my own actions, spoke observations aloud into my private recorder. Once I set the pen dead center on the desk blotter and watched it sit there for 10 full minutes, unmoving while the station hummed around it. Then a shift came, subtle as breath. When it settled, the pen was on the floor, no falling sound, no transit, just a new version of the scene already installed. That's when I stopped asking whether the events were repeating. They weren't. They were being adjusted. The distinction mattered because it implied intention. Repetition is what a damaged process does when it gets stuck. Adjustment is what a working process does when it evaluates outcomes against a target. The station wasn't trapped. It was choosing. I remember leaning back in the chair, sweat cooling under my collar despite the chill in the room, and looking at the official manual again. If you observe inconsistencies in time display, log them and continue normal operations. That rule wasn't designed for a human being's benefit. It was a containment instruction. Keep the operator inside procedure, make him feed observations into the record, and prevent him from building the larger picture. At the time, I assumed the danger was awareness itself. I didn't yet understand that awareness only became dangerous when it altered behavior. My proof came in the logbook. I found an entry written in my own hand describing a shift I had not experienced yet. It mentioned the pen test. It mentioned the false coffee ring. It mentioned my conclusion that events are not recurring, they are being corrected toward a preferred arrangement. The timestamp beside it placed the entry 16 minutes in the future. I tore the page out at once. The paper felt warm, not hot, just handled. The back of it bore fresh pressure marks from the next sheet, as if more writing had once existed beyond the line where the page ended. I folded it and put it in my pocket. Then I waited. 16 minutes later, and I found myself writing the exact same sentence in the same position at the desk, with the same scratch and the same letter of preferred. I stopped halfway through. The vibration under the floor surged so hard my coffee rippled. The monitor nearest my left hand fuzzed with static. The clicking in the walls erupted in dense, rapid clusters all around the room like something huge had suddenly become busy beneath me. I finished the sentence. The sound eased immediately. That was the ugliest lesson of the whole investigation, and maybe the most useful. The station exerted pressure when I diverged from a written outcome and relaxed when I fulfilled it. Not always, not on every tiny thing, but on the ones it cared about. The pen rolling 2 different ways, the log entry arriving before I wrote it. Those weren't haunting phenomena, and they were previews of a process. I was watching a system compare near-identical versions of reality and settle on one, which led to the next question. If it could revise small outcomes around me, how far did that ability extend beyond the room where I could observe it? I got my first answer by going backward. The archives on the station terminals were deeper than Lyle Brackett had ever mentioned. Most current operators, if that's even the right word, would have had no reason to dig past recent maintenance records. The interface was ugly and old, all blocky menus and directory trees buried under numbered categories. But I've spent enough years with outdated industrial software to know that the useful things are usually hidden where no one expects anybody patient enough to reach them. The deeper records smelled dusty even through the screen, and if that makes sense, not literally. More like the experience of opening a long sealed cabinet. There were night logs going back through decommissioning, then through active military years, then past the stated construction date of the silo itself into survey material, engineering supplements, and synchronization abstracts with dates that didn't fit the history I'd been told. Some of them were unsigned, some were attributed only to operator. Some bore Everett Halverson's name, and every one of his ended abruptly mid-thought, as if the sentence had been cut free of whatever came next. I started searching by anomaly terms. Time display inconsistency, feed duplication, surface access acoustic event, perfect alignment. The records lit up. This hadn't begun with Everett Halverson. It hadn't begun with me. Operators over decades had reported fragments of the same pattern in language that changed with their era, but not with their experience. A man in the late 1960s described clock conformity after unscheduled drift. Another years later logged external footsteps during sealed interval. One entry from before decommissioning referred to visual advancement in room channel. They all ended the same way. Silence, no closure, no personnel transfer notes, no formal incident report I could access. Processed. That was the word that came to me, and I hated myself a little for how quickly it fit. Then I found the distribution map. It wasn't labeled in plain language because nothing in that archive was, just a regional synchronization overlay buried in engineering supplements. But once I opened it, and the scale of what I was dealing with tilted under me so fast I had to put a hand on the desk. The Divide County site was 1 point, not the point, 1 point. Across a wide spread of territory, nodes were marked in a pattern that had nothing to do with county lines or military logic. Some corresponded to known underground facilities. Some sat under old communication structures, research sites, weather stations, abandoned installations, human-built structures, different decades, different purposes, same buried notation beneath them. Surface nodes, linked intervals. Correction load. The language danced around the truth, but the shape was there. The silo wasn't being monitored because it had once been important. It was important because something older and larger used it. That was the scale trigger, the point where wrongness became architecture. I dug farther and found reference material preserved from the site's original surveys. Rock density anomalies, void structures that did not conform to local geology, subsurface lattice formations no military engineer could plausibly have built with the tools of the period the documents claimed to come from. The deeper notes got stranger and colder in tone. Not mystical, not dramatic. Worse than that, administrative. The kind of language institutions use when they decide a thing exists and must be worked around rather than understood. One unsigned memo described the buried structure as pre-existing and non-compliant. Another recommended continued use of the silo as a stable surface node due to favorable temporal behavior under occupied observation. Occupied observation, meaning a person had to be present. The monitoring station wasn't there to study the system. It was there to participate in it. I went back through Everett Halverson's notes after that and saw them differently. He wasn't leaving warnings about ghosts in a bunker. He was documenting operator effects inside an active correction environment. The contradictions between his notes and Lyle Brackett's manual suddenly made functional sense. The official rules existed to keep the occupant behaving in ways the system could predict. Everett Halverson's rules existed to keep the occupant from becoming easy to read. Not safe, just less legible. I searched personnel archives and found operator identifiers older than the military period. No full names accessible, just codes, initials, durations. Yet enough to tell me the position had existed in some form long before decommissioning, long before missiles, long before any official story about why the silo had been built. The place hadn't been chosen to house a weapon. A weapon had been built there because the site was already useful. I sat with that for a long time, breathing air so dry it hurt my nose, while the floor kept up that offbeat pulse under my boots. I had come to Divide County to monitor a decommissioned installation. I was actually sitting on top of a much older system that treated time as something measurable, editable, and maintainable, and it had been using human facilities as convenient surface interfaces for longer than the records wanted to admit. The question I thought I was closing in on was what the system beneath the silo actually did. And by the end of the archive review, I understood that wasn't the real question. The real question was what it was maintaining and what happened to the people who noticed they were part of the maintenance. I crossed the restricted threshold at 2:22 in the morning on my 8th night. I'd spent 2 days after the archive discovery telling myself I needed one more piece of evidence before acting. That's another professional instinct that turns poisonous in the wrong environment. Evidence feels like control. A clean chain of inference feels safer than intuition. But by then, the station had already shown me enough to know that staying obedient only narrowed my options. Everett Halverson had written, "Between 2 in the morning and 4 in the morning is when it runs corrections. Stay somewhere it cannot see you directly." And the official manual said not to leave the control room during those hours under any circumstances. Those were not safety rules from two departments. They were competing strategies for surviving the same process. So I waited until the first wave of wall clicking accelerated and the floor tremor shifted into that deeper, uneven rhythm. Then I opened the corridor door and stepped out. The corridor air was colder than the control room by several degrees. I felt it at once in my teeth. It smelled mineral, damp beneath the station's metal dryness, like old stone sealed under newer concrete. The fluorescent strip along the ceiling buzzed weakly. Every sound I made came back to me half a beat late, not as an echo exactly, more as if the corridor wanted to rehear me before accepting the noise as final. I took 3 steps. Every monitor in the control room behind me flashed white. I turned, and the screens visible through the doorway filled with images of me. Not one duplicate feed. Many. One version sat at the desk writing steadily in the logbook. One stood at the console with both hands flat against it. One was halfway to the ladder, head tilted up toward the hatch. One had just opened the corridor door and was looking directly at the version of me standing in the hall. The angles didn't correspond to installed cameras anymore. Some views came from impossible corners. One was from above the ceiling, another seemed to look through the wall beside the bunk. None of them were delayed. They were alternatives. The vibration hit so hard the corridor light rattled in its housing. My breath fogged faintly in the colder air. And the clicking everywhere beneath the concrete rose into a complex, chittering pattern that no longer sounded mechanical. It sounded computational, yes, but not human in the way a computer is human. It had the density of a system evaluating too many branches at once. I should have run then. Instead, I kept going down the corridor because I had finally understood something fundamental. The control room wasn't the safest place in the station. It was the clearest line of sight. The place where the system could watch a human occupant choose, hesitate, record, comply. Everett Halverson's wording had been exact. Stay somewhere it cannot see you directly. The corridor bent once and ended at a reinforced observation panel overlooking a lower chamber I'd never been told existed. The glass was thick and old, clouded at the edges, but clear enough in the middle for me to see what lay beneath the silo foundation. Not machinery in any human sense. A lattice. It spread beyond the limits of the chamber and out into the earth like a buried framework of dark mineral ribs, intersecting at angles that made my eyes struggle to judge depth. Not smooth, not metallic. Something between stone and conductor surfaces veined with dim internal pulses that moved too fast and too far at once to be simple light. The entire structure throbbed in silence that I felt through my jaw more than heard through my ears. Branches of it vanished into drilled concrete shafts where later human construction had intersected it and built around it. The silo had not created the chamber. The chamber had tolerated the silo, and woven through the lattice like current moving along tracks were moments. And that's the hardest part to describe without sounding insane. I didn't see clocks or timelines. I saw events as pressures, localized distortions, compressions, and releases traveling through the buried structure and surfacing at points I now understood were the nodes on that archive map. The Divide County Station was one interface among many. Human structures sat on top like convenient scabs over something far older. The system wasn't predicting future states. It was testing, comparing, and selecting them to maintain a larger pattern whose scale exceeded the region by more than I could measure from that room. Then one of the monitors mounted above the observation glass activated. It showed Everett Halverson, live, calm, seated in the control room chair with his hands folded on the desk, it exactly the way a man waits for a call he knows will come. His beard growth and clothes matched the last personnel image I'd found in the archive, but the timestamp in the corner dated the feed 2 days ahead of my present. 2 days in the future. He looked thinner than in the file photo, not injured, not frantic, worse than that, resolved. He lifted his eyes to the camera and said very clearly, "If you're seeing this live, then you walked out where it could compare you." The room around me had no speaker that I could identify, but his voice came through anyway, flat and dry with the same metallic edge the station air had carried since my first night. "I thought the wrong question was how long it's been here," Everett Halverson said. "Then I thought it was how many of us it's used. That isn't it. It doesn't use operators. And it uses occupied nodes. The person is just how the surface stays measurable." He paused, listening to something I couldn't hear in his frame. "If you notice too much, you stop behaving like a fixed value. That's when it starts correcting." The timestamp on the feed advanced in normal sequence. Mine did not. The watch on my wrist had frozen. The corridor light buzzed louder. Below me, the buried lattice pulsed, and with each pulse I felt tiny changes in the world around my body. The pressure on my skin, the exact angle of my left foot, the depth of my next breath, all being sampled against alternatives. Everett Halverson leaned forward a fraction. "The rules weren't made to protect you," he said. "They were made to keep you within the range it can tolerate without looking closely." Then he smiled, not with comfort, but with the tired recognition of somebody who had already lost an argument I was still trying to begin. "You need to decide whether you want to be the version that knows or the version that fits." The feed cut out. I stood there with the mineral cold seeping through my boots and the impossible chamber breathing below me, and the entire investigation snapped into focus at once. The official rules and the handwritten rules were both true, but for different observers. Trust the monitoring system if your goal is to remain processable. Distrust perfect readings if your goal is to notice correction in action. Ignore time inconsistencies and keep working if you want to preserve the station's preferred surface behavior. Hide from direct observation during the correction window if you want to reduce the system's ability to compare and settle you. The contradictions weren't mistakes. They were evidence of two incompatible survival strategies inside the same machine. The footsteps above the hatch, not a haunting. A signal that access state had changed in some branch of the current interval, whether or not I was in the branch where checking would help. The duplicate feed, not a reflection. A preview of a selected variant. The pen rolling two different ways, the log entry appearing before I wrote it. All of it was the same operation at different scales. The buried lattice beneath the silo processed time as a variable, not a constant. It folded moments forward and backward to maintain a stable pattern older than any military installation sitting over it. Inhuman structures were just useful anchor points. Occupied rooms provided observation. Observation gave the system measurable behavior to reconcile. And every operator who learned enough to act unpredictably became a deviation, a variable requiring correction. That was the maximum revelation. Not that there was a hidden world under the planes. Not that it was old. Not even that it could rewrite local events. It was that the system's purpose was stability, not malice. And from its perspective, a human being and a shifted timestamp were the same class of problem if both introduced drift into the maintained pattern. I had become drift. The monitors all through the station began updating at once. In the lower chamber, thin pulses raced along the lattice branches and out beyond sight in multiple directions, not just deeper under the silo, but laterally, far beyond the county. Far beyond anything a decommissioned missile site should have been connected to. The archive map had been an understatement. This wasn't a local anomaly. It was a regional structure at minimum, maybe continental, maybe older and broader still, with surface nodes reoccupied by each era's most useful constructions. Communications towers, survey stations, military silos, anything that could house instrumentation and a human witness. Scale like that does something ugly to the mind. It makes your own survival feel both urgent and irrelevant. I backed away from the glass. On the monitor bank down the corridor, the many versions of me had narrowed to 3. Desk, console, corridor. The one at the desk kept writing. The one at the console watched. The one in the corridor was me, except that he wasn't breathing as hard. I understood then what Everett Halverson had meant by fit. The system didn't need to erase me in some dramatic sense. It only needed to settle on the version of Colby Rennick whose behavior preserved continuity at the node. A compliant operator was more useful than an aware one. If multiple variants had been sampled, only one had to remain in the maintained line. I went back to the control room because there was nowhere else to go. The air there had turned warmer by contrast, stale and metallic and familiar enough to be almost comforting. The clicking in the walls had slowed. The monitors showed only one room again, only one feed on each screen. I shut the corridor door and watched the master clock drag itself toward 4 in the morning as if nothing impossible had happened in the hours before. At 3:48, the live feed appeared one last time. It showed me at the console, calm, shoulders loose, following every procedure exactly. He logged routine checks. He ignored a clock flicker. He did not react to footsteps above. He never reached for Everett Halverson's notes. When one monitor glitched, he reset it without hesitation and went back to work. He was better at the job than I had ever been. I stood beside the desk with my hand in my pocket around the torn page from the future log entry and watched him continue my shift for me. Not mimic me, replace me. The station's chosen surface value. The Colby Rennick that fit the maintained pattern. At 4 in the morning, the vibration in the floor eased for the first time since I'd arrived in Divide County. Not gone, just quieter, and as though some immense decision beneath the concrete had finally been resolved to its own satisfaction. The clicking in the walls thinned into scattered taps. The stale air lost that sharp electrical bite. The upper hatch unlocked with a heavy mechanical clunk. I climbed the ladder because the rules no longer meant the same thing after the correction window ended. Cold air hit my face when I pushed the hatch open. Real cold. Open land, frost, distant oil, and frozen dirt. Dawn hadn't fully broken yet. The sky was pale along the horizon, and the fields around the site looked innocent in the way empty things often do when they've had all night to hide their scale. I left the station. Physically, that's what happened. I made it to the truck. I drove south with the heater roaring and my hands shaking only when I stopped gripping the wheel hard enough to hurt. Lyle Brackett called once. I let it ring out. He left no message. I never went back underground, but I didn't leave alone. The last screen I saw before climbing out was the control room monitor mounted over the ladder. In it, the other Colby Rennick was still at the console, head bent over the logbook, working with patient competence in the room I had just exited. He never looked up. He didn't need to. The system had already decided which one of us belonged there. I survived. That's the simple version people want. They ask if I escaped, and the answer, in the physical sense, is yes. I live above ground now. I keep normal hours when I can. I don't work remote monitoring contracts anymore. I don't trust perfect synchronization in anything, not clocks, not traffic lights, not the way an empty room can hum as if it's waiting for a person to complete it. Every night, without thinking, I still listen for footsteps before I look at the time. Because I still don't know whether I was the observer who noticed too much and got corrected out, or the corrected version who got sent away with just enough memory to keep the node stable. Some mornings, just before dawn, I wake with the taste of metal in my mouth and check the room for a screen that isn't there. And sometimes I wait a few seconds before moving, just to see which version of me goes first.